At this moment in history, about 1/3 of the world's population makes some sort of claim to be a follower of Christ. That means that the group Jesus launched with just a few has spread and grown more dynamically than any other movement in history. How did this happen? Welcome to 100 Plus, a look at the most significant people, ideas, and events in Christian history. Today, we're going to look at the impact of St. Columba, a 6th century Irish missionary, to provide an overview of the history of mission. We'll back up to look at Jesus' commissioning of his apostles, the launch of the early church, and then trace how it grows to become what is now the oldest, largest, longest-lasting, most geographically dispersed, and ethnically diverse organization in history.
At this moment, about 1/3 of the world's population makes some sort of claim to be a Christ follower. I think that number is inflated. Jesus is looking for committed disciples, not just casual fans. Since Constantine made it legal to be a Christian, and in some cases, certainly in some settings, it's fashionable to be a Christian, I think that number is pretty inflated. I suspect you agree with me. You don't think that 1/3 of the world's population, 2 billion people, are followers, disciples of Christ. But go with it for now, because it helps set up our topic today, which is on the mission of the church. So, the New Testament starts with 4 Gospels, and as you likely know, these are far more passion narratives with long introductions. A passion narrative is an account of someone's death. They're passion narratives with long introductions more than their biographies, because they don't tell us a lot of things that we would expect in a biography. But they tell us enough to know that Jesus claimed to be God. He lived a perfect life. He taught with unmatched authority and insight. He fulfilled all the messianic prophecies found in the Old Testament. He made quite a point about coming to establish his kingdom. He died in what he claimed was a sacrificial and substitutionary death that was sort of foreshadowed by the messianic prophecies in the Hebrew sacrificial system. And then he rose again and he ascended into heaven. But that's not all. Before he ascended, he made 2 very significant statements. At the end of the Gospel of Matthew, in the 28th chapter, in a passage we refer to as the Great Commission, he said, all authority in heaven and earth has been given to me. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything that I have commanded. And I will be with you always, even to the very end of the age. In other words, he told his followers that they were to roll out his kingdom, and it was to be a global rollout. And then at the beginning of the book of Acts, which reports on the events that happened sort of right after the ascension of Christ and sort of go for the first 30 years, we have this related promise and prediction. It comes from the very beginning, Acts chapter 1, verse 8. Jesus said to them, his followers, you will receive power when the Holy Spirit comes upon you, and you'll be my witnesses in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and to the ends of the earth. So, in other words, after Pentecost, which is when the Holy Spirit fell on those gathered in the upper room, the church was going to start, and then it was going to spread, and it was going to quickly sort of spill forward. And that's what's happened. And it has happened over the last 2,000 years, and it's happened up to the point where we now would say 1/3 of the planet identifies with Jesus Christ. So today we're taking advantage of the fact that we've come to this 6th century Irish missionary monk, a man by the name of Columba, to sort of jump to 30,000 feet and look down at the panorama of Christian missions. I want you to realize and more fully appreciate that this movement with the disciples that Jesus launched, with this group of, sort of also-rans, this ragtag group of misfits, other people had overlooked him. Jesus launched something with them, and what he launched grew, and it grew quickly, and it grew and has gone throughout the world. It first left Jerusalem on its way to Rome, and then it left Rome on its way to Chicago or Seattle or wherever you may find yourself today. And now the church is now the largest, the oldest, the most ethnically diverse, the most geographically dispersed organization of any type in the history of the world. It's not perfect, and you don't need to remind me of that. I read enough history to know, and we'll look at some of the particularly most egregious black eyes of the church over the last 2,000 years, the Crusades, the Inquisition, the failure in a variety of different ways. The church is not perfect. By the way, I also work at a church, and so when people want to point out problems with the church, I always want to say, well, however many things you think are wrong with the church, I think more are wrong with the church. Some of the things that are wrong with the church are things I did wrong this morning. And so I understand that the church is not perfect, but the church is a marvel, and the spread of the Christian faith is something that we need to make note of. And so in this episode, we are leveraging this man, Columba, a 6th century mission-minded monk, to focus on the history of missions. Now, if you know anything about Columba, and you may not know anything, but if you know anything, you probably get him confused with St. Patrick. Perhaps you are better able than I am to keep Ireland and Scotland and their unique histories and distinctives separate. I know they're both sort of reluctant parts of Great Britain, distinct in various ways. My point is that in Columba, you have another Celtic Christ follower who thought missionally and who worked initially in the British Isles. So Patrick, St. Patrick, was a 5th century British monk who did his work in Ireland. Columba is a 6th century Irish monk who does his work in Scotland. They're both alike, they're great models, and there are others that we could leverage, but I didn't want to go too far into a history of the church before I alerted you that to something that's so obvious that you might otherwise miss it, and that is that Christianity spreads. It does so by design. So I read the Great Commission. Christians are expected. If you're a Christian, you are expected to tell others about Christ. The Christian faith spreads because it's good news. And when people really understand it, and it's hard to get people to understand the true offer, we all think it's something different. We're all sort of Arians and Pelagians at heart, now that you know those terms. But when people understand the good news, they are likely to embrace it and to share it with those that they love. And additionally, the Christian faith also spreads because as Christians are persecuted through history, they often move. And when they move, they take their faith with them. And therefore, the Christian faith has spread until it's gone around the world. So missions is also important, I should add, because it's the heart of God. When God calls Abraham, he says, I'm going to bless you to be a blessing. And the Jews are blessed, and then the church is blessed, and we are blessed in order to be a blessing and to carry this forward. So what I want to do is look at, in light of missions, I want to look at 4 periods of history. I'm trying to keep this simple. After all, I'm not a real historian. I just play one on this podcast. So I want to keep things as simple as I can. I'm going to divide the last 2,000 years into 5 periods I'm going to use. So there are a lot of ways people try and slice and dice history. You know, you can look at the Stone Age, the Bronze Age, the Iron Age. You can look at Western civilization developing like I talked about before. You track, the Greeks and the Romans, and then you get into the whole Roman Empire and the Dark Ages and all of that, the Middle Ages, and then the Renaissance and the Reformation. There's lots of different approaches to this. In one of the books I was looking at this week, reading about the history of missions out of the book Perspectives, which is a global, it's an anthology of a lot of articles on missions. And I remembered some articles about the history of missions. Well, one of the guys that I went back and read 2 of his essays, he has 2 essays in this book. He divides history initially in one article into 10 periods. In the next article, he divides it into 4 periods. I'm going to use 5. Please understand that these are somewhat artificial. Nobody living at the time of a transition is going to immediately recognize that they're living at a time of a transition. But I just want to make this simple because I want want to sort of take you ahead. We're going to jump back, but I want to take you ahead and help you get the big panorama of God's hand and the march of the church so that you can see and understand the times you're living in, the times we're living in right now, and understand them a little bit better. So phase one, we've actually already covered. That's the first 500 years, from birth to 500 AD. And it's the early church and it's the Roman era up to the fall and the start of the Middle Ages. So I'm not going to say much here other than to just underline a few things that I didn't highlight because they focus on missions. So again, Jesus asks the disciples, who do people say that I am? We have this great moment, Peter's confession. Some say, you're a prophet. Some say you're John the Baptist or you're Elijah, whatever. But then Jesus says, who do you say that I am? And he says, you are the Christ. You're the Messiah. You're the one we've been waiting for. And Jesus says, absolutely, you're spot on. Peter, that answer is so correct. I know that you didn't get it. Come up with it yourself. God the Father gave it to you. And I'm going to launch my movement on exactly that, and it is going to prevail. So he's talking about the church. It's the first time the term gets used. First time it gets used in this context. It's a Greek political term that had sort of not being used much at the time. But Jesus said he's going to launch this thing and it's going to prevail. The gates of hell will not be able to withstand its onslaught. Then in the book of Acts, we see as the church grows from 0 to 60 in about 6 seconds, or more specifically, it grows from the upper room to Rome over 30 years, and then it continues to grow, as we have already noted, up through today. Well, as we read on, we watch out of the book of Acts, we watch as the positive reception that the early church got lasted for just a few days. So after Pentecost, everybody's excited. Lots of people, 3,000 people are added to the church. Not long after that, you have Stephen being stoned as a martyr, and the Jewish religious leaders and the Roman authorities eventually turning more harshly against the church. And this is going to lead one of the Ante-Nicene fathers that I mentioned earlier, Tertullian. He is going to make this famous statement that says that the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. So as people are dying, right, they're watering the ground as they're spreading, and the church, the Christian faith, is taking off. So one of the things that you see in the book of Acts is that Paul and Barnabas are the first two missionaries. Paul gets most of the press. The second half of the book of Acts is all about Paul, really, and he's going to have 3 big mission trips. It's important to note a few things about what happens here as it relates to missions. First of all, they are going to immediately jump out of the Jewish confines and take the gospel to the Gentiles. This is enormously important, not just for those of us that are Gentiles today, but it's enormously important because it means that the gospel is going to be very portable. It's not a Jewish faith per se. It starts as a Jewish faith, absolutely. But a Gentile doesn't have to become a Jew in order to become a Christian. And so it's going to go global. It's going to be able to be contextualized. We're also going to see that Paul and Barnabas are going to be sent out by a small church. The church in Jerusalem should have sent them out as missionaries. They had the assignment. They didn't get around to it. This small church in Antioch that doesn't have leaders, doesn't have a lot of money, is going to be the ones that are going to sort of bootstrap the gospel going out to other churches. And as a pastor, I know that you never feel ready for these things to sort of start something new and send people out. There's so much more work to do with the people that are there, but we're going to see that it's always sort of on the bleeding edge. It's getting pushed forward. We're going to see that the missionary movement is largely a church planting movement. That's what Paul and Barnabas are going to do. They're going to plant churches. We're going to see that it's enormously difficult. Paul is going to be beaten and imprisoned and shipwrecked and all kinds of other things. And he's also going to have a falling out with Barnabas. Missionaries they got to be so tough and so doggedly determined that they're not going to be beaten back. They can be hard to get along with, and they have a hard time sometimes getting along with each other. I wish that wasn't the case, but the Bible's very clear about the failings of the church and the failings of the Christian leaders. The good news is they keep after it, and the rest of the church is going to grow quickly because of it. So the rest of the first 500 years, this first period, is what we have talked about already. We talked about the Ante-Nicene time. We talked about the Council Constantine and the Council of Constantinople and all those things that were happening. And the church was growing. And what I hope you didn't miss is that the church overtakes the Roman Empire, which was shocking. Had you said you backed up to the time of Jesus or to Paul and Peter, who are going to be killed under the persecution by Nero, we believe. Remember, Nero starts the fire and he's persecuting the Christians. So had you said back then to Paul and to Peter, in the future, 2,000 years from now, people are going to be naming their children after you. And they're going to be naming their dogs after Nero and Caesar. But it goes, it grows, it spreads. So if you read church history about this time, you're going to hear someone note that the Roman Empire also made it possible. The 250,000 miles of road that the Romans created, the common language that was established by the Greeks and then carried forward by the Romans, all of this set up the church to grow like a brush fire in this first period. But I want to now move on to the second epoch, which is 1,000 years long. This is going to start in 500 and go through 1500. So this is the Middle Ages, and we've been dabbling in this period. Remember, I said the Middle Ages has the early Middle Ages, sometimes referred to as the Dark Ages. It has the Middle Ages, usually referred to as the High Middle Ages, and then it has the late Middle Ages. So I've already given a brief overview of this period when I talked about the flow of the sack of Rome, and I talked about Western civilization. Talked about it a little bit with Gregory the Great and St. Patrick as well. So let me just make 6 observations, missional observations about this time. So first of all, the monks rock. I have not done enough to persuade you that the early monks, so not to be confused with the later monks. So as Protestants, we think of the Augustinian monks around the time of Luther, who were wealthy and lazy and a little bit, I would argue, a little bit heretical. Don't get them confused with these earlier monks that came 1,000 years before them. The Benedictines, the Celts, and others did some great work of advancing the gospel. Mark Knoll, he is subsequently retired from Notre Dame, but he used to be a professor of church history at Wheaton. And in a paper called The Monastic Rescue of the Church, Mark Knoll, while a Wheaton professor, writes, the rise of monasticism was, after Christ's commission to his disciples, the most important and in many ways the most beneficial institutional event in the history of Christianity. So the monks rock. They carry forward the gospel. They preserve Christian culture. They do so many things that we are indebted to them for. Secondly, people groups start coming to faith. So early on in this first 500-year period, people coming to faith, it was usually one here, one there, your parents, your kids, your neighbor coming to faith. When we get into the Middle Ages, what we see is as the faith is being shared by groups, by the monks, by others, it will be whole people groups, it will be whole villages, it will be whole areas. Eventually it'll be everybody under a certain king. If the king declares their faith in Christ, everyone in that kingdom is expected to follow Christ. This is not as we would expect faith to work. There's lots of problems with this, but it is what happens, and in some cases it works. Third thing to note about this period, we're focusing mostly on Western civilization, or the Western half of the Roman Empire. The Eastern half of the Roman Empire, which doesn't really have a Middle Ages in the same way, because the Middle Ages is also sort of a period of Christendom. It doesn't really have the collapse of Christendom. It's different. But the Eastern half of the empire, also referred to sometimes as the Byzantine Empire, they are going to get after some missions work, and they're going to be sending missionaries out as well. Some of these will be going into places like Russia. So you'll have the Russian Orthodox Church. Fourth thing to note about the Middle Ages is that there are some key names from a missions perspective, some of whom we'll cover in more detail later on. But just as we're giving this 30,000-foot overview, names I ought to mention, Boniface, one of the great Roman missionaries that's going to take the gospel into a lot of the Germanic tribes and establish a lot of Benedictine monasteries. Also, Charlemagne, very important person, like a second Constantine. So after the Dark Ages, when the barbarians overtake Rome and you go down this very dark period for a number of years, the Irish, quote unquote, save civilization, you're going to see that the barbarians are going to be won to faith. Or at the very least, they're going to be civilized by Arianism. So remember the Arians, they got chased away because they wouldn't fully embrace the full deity of Christ. So they get pushed out of the Roman Empire, and they're going to be out there. They will be doing some missionary work, and you see the barbarians between the Arian missionaries and the Christian missionaries becoming civilized. And then Charlemagne, who is going to try and pull the empire back together again. This is when in the 800s, so in the 9th century, we have the Holy Roman Empire, which I said is sort of not holy, not Roman, not an empire. There's a lot of military might being used to sort of persuade people that they ought to trust Christ. And this, of course, is also going to lead us into one of the more troubling missionary enterprises of the Christian faith, and that is the Crusades, when a number of people will go down to reclaim the promised land, the Holy Land, so that Christian pilgrims can go down there, and they're trying to convert the Muslims, and this goes on for hundreds of years, and for about 100 years, the Christians will be successful in reclaiming the Holy Land, but they will lose it, and this, of course, is a huge black eye to those who, Muhammad, and we're going to look at Islam in our next episode, because it's such an important event in shaping Christianity in one way. But it's one thing if you claim to conquer with the sword. It's another thing if you conquer by dying, and you conquer by serving and loving your enemy. It doesn't work for the church at all. So there are other things that we could talk about. I mean, you got, oh my goodness, in the Middle Ages, you've got all these other things that are going to influence the church, and so they're going to influence missions. The Black Plague, where a third to a half of the people in some areas are going to be wiped out by the plague. That's obviously going to shape things. We can just see how much COVID is shaping us, and the percentage of people that have died is like, 0.3% maybe. So you've got a huge change that's going to come with the Black Plague. You've got scholasticism, you've got the Crusades, you've got the building of the cathedrals, you've got the rise of the universities. A lot of these things, we'll look at all these in the future. But we're water skiing over this 1,000-year period in order to just have you see the big period. So the first 500 years. Second one was 1,000 years, 500 to 1,500. The third period is 1,500 to 1950. So, and I'm going to divide this into the Roman Catholic mission effort and the Protestant mission effort. So the Protestants are going to start, Martin Luther's going to nail his theses, 95 Theses, under the door of the Wittenberg Castle in 1517. We just had the 500th anniversary. October 31st, 1517 is when he does this. So we're now going to have two different kinds of mission movements. And the first one we're going to look at is the Roman Catholic one, which is really big for the first couple hundred years here. So if you remember your world history class, or your world civilization class, or your Western civilization class from high school, and I'm sure you do. I'm sure you remember everything about that. My world civ class was taught by the football coach. He did not want to be teaching world civ, and I didn't want to be taking world civ. So neither one of us were happy, but I digress. So let me just note that This all comes about during the Age of Discovery. So as we enter the 1500s, Europe is busy exploring and colonizing the world, with Spain and Portugal and France sort of partnering with the Roman Catholic Church and taking the initial lead. So Portugal receives the Pope's blessing to claim control over the west coast of Africa. As every school child knows, or at least used to, the Spanish are going to head to the Americas. In 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue, and the Pope is going to grant Spain all the territory west of the 47th longitude. And then the French are going to head into more North America. So now, the Roman Catholic Church is expecting that the countries, and we just have got the whole nation states developing about this time, that these countries are going to be operating as evangelistic arms of the church. And as they go to find these new people in Africa and in the Americas and other places, they're going to be doing missionary efforts. And so most of this work is going to fall on these groups, the Franciscans, the Dominicans, later on the Jesuits. It's going to be different groups going to different countries based on who sort of owns that country, and they're going to use very different methods. Some of the methods were actually pretty nice. You've got some groups. So St. Ignatius of Loyola, who founds the Jesuits, are going to call the Jesuits to a life of poverty. And they're going to go out to serve people, to tell them about Christ, to help people. There's a lot of sort of good missiological work that happens there. In North America, the French are going to try and establish among indigenous people in Canada, they're going to try and establish missionary outposts and share the gospel with missionaries without fundamentally reshaping Indian life or reshaping it as little as possible. But some of what happens is not good, and it's not only not good, it's really bad, as you can imagine. Nobody bothered asking the people living in these uncolonized parts of the world or the non-European lands whether they wanted the church. Again, this is the Catholic Church at this point, wanted the church to come down and civilize them. So many of the explorers, the conquistadors, are going to use a fair bit of violence to claim land, and they're going to take the indigenous people under the name of evangelism. They're going to enslave them, and it's not one of the brightest moments of the church. And a lot of these efforts are, of course, going to collapse in on themselves. In spite of some of these bad practices, we do see that the Roman Catholic Church spreads, and the church gains vast numbers of people in these lands for the faith. So, on the other side of the equation, you have the Protestants. So the Catholics are doing, in this period, 1500 to 1950, they're doing the bulk of their work early. The Protestants do virtually nothing for the first couple hundred years after getting established. That's a problem. We'll pick that up a little bit later. But they're going to do a lot later on. Protestant mission effort is going to pick up in the 19th century or in the 1800s. So you have, of course, some earlier work being done. The people on the Mayflower, right, are seeking, they're Puritans, they're seeking freedom of worship. They're going to go to this place where they will have freedom of worship, and they're also going to do evangelism among the people here. Both the Virginia and Massachusetts charters call for the conversion. And there's training that goes on with, like the Dutch East Indians Company, training people to be missionaries and to take the gospel. So there are a number of names to note here with Protestant work. Early on, you got people like Jonathan Edwards, who you might know that name. Many consider him the most brilliant person ever to live in North America. He is in the U.S. As a pastor. His grandfather had been a pastor. And he's going to be one of the early presidents of Princeton. But he spent some time as a missionary to the American Indians. You've also got people like the Wesley brothers, John and Charles Wesley, who will come to the U.S. before it's the U.S. They're Brits. They'll come and they'll establish orphanages. They establish a big orphanage in Georgia. A bit later, you're going to see other people that are going to begin to emerge, bigger names around missions in the 18th century. William Carey, a shoe repairman who's inspired by the voyages of Captain Cook, and he decides that he is going to call people to take the gospel to people all over, and he will head to India, where he will spend the rest of his life. He's an organizer. He gets lots of other people motivated. He writes some books, gets them motivated, and he's going to do great stuff. He is going to work in India to stop infanticide, where infants, especially girls, were left out to die. He's going to stop the practice of young Indian widows throwing themselves onto the funeral pyre of their deceased husband. He's going to establish a college. We're going to see lots of good missionary activity taking place. Amy Carmichael, a big name here. Samuel Mills, he's a student at Williams College, and he's going to call on other students to be praying for world evangelization. They get caught famously one day in a storm, and they hide somehow in a haystack, and there will be this haystack prayer revival that is going to start out of that. It will lead to the student volunteer movement. It will be one of the things that Dwight Moody here in Chicago will get started. Hundreds and hundreds of students out of this will become missionaries and go to the mission field. It's during this time that a lot of these mission agencies are started in Bible societies, Salvation Army, the Red Cross, the YMCA. All of these, the YMCA, the Young Men's Christian Association, all of these are zealously evangelistic in their early days. Hudson Taylor will then come along, and he will start China Inland Mission. So you'll have another wave. After initially evangelism is going to the coastlines of Africa and Asia, now you're going to have people starting the Sudan Interior Mission, SIM, or African Interior Mission, AIM, taking the gospel further in. Radio is going to start eventually to become part of the missionary strategy that Protestants and Catholics will use, but some of the largest, even today, largest radio stations in the world are Christian radio stations talking about Christ. This is a very exciting time in Protestant missions, and Protestants are going to be involved in not only inviting people to come to faith, but they're going to be on the forefront in Africa, Asia, Latin America, of starting hospitals and schools and colleges and orphanages and women care shelters and all kinds of things. Now, again, not perfect. There are downsides. Some of this work remains more colonial than we would like. It is less contextualized than we would be comfortable with today. So they're often exporting Western culture, not just the Christian faith. Some unhealthy patterns of dependence come along. But I'm hoping so this series is called 100 Plus. I have 100 lectures that I'm giving. The plus is going to be interviews with authors and leading thinkers. And one of the people I'm trying to get is Robert Woodbury. I'm now old enough. I knew his father. But Robert Woodbury, just his last couple of years, has published a dissertation that is really rocking the secular world, because he points out that the best places to live today, the places that have the most stable governments, the most care and advanced attitudes towards women, these places are the places that Protestant missionaries went to in the 18th and the 19th centuries. And that's not a popular story to tell in the secular academy. He's had to work enormously hard to get his dissertation recognized in those circles. But a lot of really good work goes on by missionaries. Don't be embarrassed by the missionary efforts that have gone on. So that brings us to the fourth phase of missions. This is 1950 to 2000, which is mostly about Protestant expansion. And again, the whole entire 20th century, in one sense, is referred to as the great century of Protestant missions. So several important things to note here. This is a time when a lot of parachurch ministries come on board. So after the end of World War II, you have all these people, all these GIs coming back. They've been all over the world. They've learned a lot of leadership skills, and they have a heart for the world, and they're going to come back, and they're going to grow the U.S., right? It's going to grow, and a lot of the secular institutions, organizations are going to come online, and a lot of Christian organizations and global enterprises are going to come online. So World Vision, World Relief, Campus Crusade, Young Life, Mission Aviation Fellowship, Pioneers, YWAM, New Tribes, all of these, Urbana, all of these things are going to start with this big mission focus. You have some big names here. Jim and Elizabeth Elliott, who reach out, the Wheaton students, they go down and they're doing work in Papua New Guinea, and the men all lose their lives. So what you may not know, at Christ Church, the pastor previous to me at Christ Church, Bob Thomas, the pastor previous to Bob was Walt Liefeld. Walt's wife, Olive Liefeld, was initially Olive Fleming. She was one of the 4 couples that were down there that were killed where the men were all killed by the Indians, and she remarried later, remarried Walt. So you've got these mission stories, lots of people getting excited. Of course, you've got Billy Graham, not just doing like crusade evangelism in the U.S. and around the world, but also mobilizing missionaries all over the world, and that's going to lead to a surge of missionary activity. This period, the 20th century, will be a period of big activity around Bible translation. So you got the group Wycliffe comes along. Wycliffe is named after a 14th century sort of pre-Protestant who wanted to get the Bible into the language, the common secular language, vernacular language of the people. So Wycliffe will come along to translate the Bible into languages, and they will leverage this in a variety of ways. The Jesus film comes along leveraging some of the translation work that's been done. And you're going to see, another thing, you're going to see big push to push the leadership of the church into the South and into the East. Some of this will grow out of the work done by John Stott and Billy Graham and others with the Lausanne Congress on world evangelization out of the 70s. So let me just note, when I was working as the president of CISF, now Scholar Leaders, we used to say, pointing out how rapidly things were changing. In 1800, 1% of the world's Christians were found in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. By 1900, it was 10%. By 1960, it was 42% of the Christians in the world were found in Africa, Asia, Latin America. By the 20th century, by the end of the 20th century, it was 70%. And we said, and I would say, at some point, any day now, Africa, Asia, and Latin America are sending out more missionaries to the U.S. and around the world than we're sending out. That has certainly happened. And you see these other things take place, such as the Cultural Revolution kicks in under Mao, where he sort of shuts down, kicks out the West, the bamboo curtain goes up, all the missionaries leave. When they leave, they think there's like 2 million Christians in China, and the missionaries are distraught because they're kicked out of the country, and it's a country of at that point not 1 billion people, but headed in that direction. But when the Cultural Revolution ends, what is discovered is that the church, in the hands of the indigenous leaders, has exploded. So this missionary effort had put in place the structure to allow the church to grow with its own leaders. And so some would say there were 30 million Christians when the Cultural Revolution ended. Some would say 100 million. You also see other things that are just happening during this time period. Good grief, we're covering 2,000 years in 40 minutes. So you're going to see lots of other changes, lots of missionary enterprise fueled by the travel that is now going on, fueled by the fall of communism, the explosion of Pentecostalism, missionary efforts going in a variety of different ways. So let me wrap up by saying there's a fifth period that we're not talking about now, obviously from 2000 up through today. Let me just wrap this up by trying to summarize where we find ourselves. I want you to be aware that we have a mission. I want you to be reminded that we have a mission. Or to put it more in language that I have appreciated, it's not that the church has a mission, it's that God's mission has a church. So we have an assignment. We get this assignment. We see it all the way playing out in Genesis 12. We particularly see it given to us in Matthew 28, 18 through 20. Secondly, I want you to know that there's a lot of wonderful things that have happened because of Christian mission. A lot of truly wonderful things. You don't hear about them so much today in colleges and universities, and there's a lot of things that people are going to push back on, but a whole lot of good things happened. Not exclusively. There were extended stretches where people seemed to get off task. We need to be reminded that we have to keep our nose in the book. His plan is captured. God's plan is captured on the pages of Scripture, and a lot of things change. The way you carry out the mission of the church looks different in some ways today than it did 2,000 years ago, but we've got to be certain that although our methods may be somewhat fluid, our message is not. We've got to keep the book as an anchor. A third thing that I would want you to see is that an overview of the mission of the church, an overview of 2,000 years, would remind us that we are to be people who are proclaiming the good news and engaging in good works. We have to do both. We are called to do both. We are called to tell people about an empty tomb, about Christ, about eternal life, about forgiveness of sins. And we are called to love people. We're called to bring the kingdom, the values that Jesus talks about in the Sermon on the Mount. We are called to care for the widow and orphan. We are called to be people who are going to carry both of these things forward. Fourth, I want you to know that none of this happens without prayer. And I'm looking at my time and I'm realizing that I really didn't say anything about Columba. So I have to pick him up at some later point. There's a whole lot of reasons to look at somebody like Columba or St. Patrick or Boniface or all of these different people and see that one person can make a huge difference. And I hope that you are inspired and encouraged by what has happened over 2,000 years and the opportunity you have to be part of this going forward. Next episode, we'll look at Islam and its impact on the church.